Welcome to Module 2, Lesson 1, Work Before Industrialization, or How Making Things Easier May Have Made Things More Complicated. Let's talk about the nature of work. Work is what we do to make a livelihood. It's the things that we do to meet our needs and wants. And a lot of times, especially in modern day, we spend so much time working that we identify ourselves, who we are, with what we do. People say, what do you do? I'm a nurse. I'm a mechanic. I don't say I do nursing or I instruct. I'm an instructor. And that's an interesting thing to ponder. But let's talk about primitive societies and how they worked and what they needed to do to work. Okay, just because tools were simple doesn't mean the technology to make them were necessarily simple. All we have to do is look at the year you're on, and the idea of the stone axe heads. Okay, they were a very simple tool, the axes. However, making them wasn't necessarily that easy. You had to find the right stone, you had to find the right thing, you had to chip it to make it sharp. Arrowheads, even very primitive arrowheads, there's a technique to doing it. If you've ever tried to make an arrowhead, I mean, it's not that easy. And although primitive people may have had specific work roles, they usually did all the tasks required for production from beginning to end. So if I was a hunter, I didn't just go hunting, I also made my own weaponry, hunted. Maybe I would process the kill, gut it and skin it, to prepare it for the next person. So I didn't just do one task, I did all the tasks required for that production. Tools allowed humans to control their environment. So things like weapons and, things to crush plants and seeds allowed people to control their environment. And why did we need to do that? Well, if you look at people as animals instead of people, we're not all that successfully put together. We don't run fast. We don't have fur to protect us. We don't have big claws and big teeth. We don't have a whole lot going for us when it comes to the animal kingdom. So we use the tools to control our environment. We use them, and as we produce tools to help us out, to compensate for the characteristics we don't have, we developed our brains. Okay? And that's what puts us apart. This is what makes us successful, is our ability to think and to think ahead. And in addition to just being able to think, we passed our knowledge on to future generations, and that's education. Let's look at the Kung. The Kung are a tribe of nomadic hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, and hunting and gathering was the first livelihood. Okay, people hunted animals, wild animals, and they gathered wild plants in order to survive. So the Kung is sort of this step back in history. They only spend about 19 hours a week gathering the sufficient food for a sound nutritional diet. Only 19 hours. I wish I only had to work 19 hours to meet all my needs. Okay? So what do these folks do when they're not out hunting and gathering? Well, what they do is they visit with family and friends, they take part in rituals, they socialize, they strengthen the bond of the group. And one of the things you also have to understand is that the group usually stays fairly small because, think about what they have to do. They have to move and follow the herds, they have to bond with each other. That bond within the group is very important, okay, for success. They don't have a lot of possessions because they don't need them. Anybody who's ever moved a lot realizes that the more you move, the less you want or the less you need, because it's tough dragging a lot of stuff around you're not going to use. Okay, so they don't have a lot of possessions. The next step in the evolution of working is agriculture. Now, why would we move from hunting and gathering to agriculture? Well, there's a problem with hunting and gathering because you are dependent upon external forces. You're dependent upon the weather, you're dependent upon the herds and all that other stuff. And that affects your ability to produce nutrition, to produce food, okay? So and people want to be able to control that. And one of the ways people control, again, their environment is agriculture, farming. So we started planting seeds of the plants we eat and controlling them, growing them, nurturing them. We start raising food animals, okay? Cows for milk and meat and chickens and whatever have you. Now we are controlling our food supply instead of being dependent upon nature to supply it and the vagaries of nature to supply it for us. Okay, so we're controlling it. But there's a problem with controlling food production. One of the problems is you're not going to move around a lot. Okay, you don't move around anymore. We have a higher density so we can support more people. If we're not moving around, if we're controlling our food supplies, we don't have to keep our group small. We can have a larger group. Okay? But it also requires a lot more time and energy for production. So that 19 hours a week grows. Because what do we have to do? We have to replenish the nutrients in the fields, we have to work the fields, we have to irrigate the fields, we have to harvest the crops, seed and harvest, we have to take care of the animals and feed the animals and all this other stuff that we have to do that we didn't have to do before. Okay? So we see a huge increase in time spent controlling our environment. We also, with the expanse in population, see the rise of specialization. So, as we see agricultural settlements increase, we see the rise of towns and villages and towns and even cities. Okay, and then we start seeing some people specializing in certain crafts. Okay, so we have a blacksmith or we have a weaver or whatever. Now, if I'm a blacksmith, I'm not out farming. Okay, so how do I get my food? Well, we see the rise of trade. So I'm a farmer, I need a new plow blade. I'm a blacksmith, I can make you a plow blade, but if I make you a plow blade, you have to give me some of what you have for what I need. So we see trade. One of the things we see when we start seeing trade is a change in economic relationships. Now remember, when you're a hunter-gatherer, you need to have a good relationship within the group. Same thing if you're working on a farm. Okay, you don't want to be in conflict with the people you're working side by side with every day. But if you're in a trade relationship, the relationship is more short term. It's not as involved. And once you make that trade, right, pretty much that's the end of it could be the end of relationship. Okay? So we see a difference in how we are relating to other people once we see the rise of trade. Sometimes the work you did, a lot of times, was determined by your social standing. So if you were a farmer or a peasant, chances are you were going to be a farmer or a peasant. If you were a craftsperson, chances are you were going to be a craftsperson. If you were a noble, chances are you were going to be a noble. What you were born into a lot of times determined what you did with the rest of your life. Okay? So part of this had to do with guilds. Now guilds are a group of people engaged in the same kind of occupations. Very similar. They're sort of the precursors to modern day unions. But they're different than unions in a very basic, important way, was that guilds restricted what they did to their guild. You learned, say you were going to be a silversmith. You learned about silversmithing and everything that you needed to do with silversmithing, and you talked with other silversmiths about how processes and things to do, but you never talked about what you did as a silversmith to, say, a weaver or a blacksmith. Never. You never shared that information. It was kept within the guild. But the guilds also had an educational system. It was called an apprenticeship system, and we see a little bit of this today when we look at things like electrical and plumbing still has a sort of, so what you have is an apprentice, you go to live with a master, you learn the craft, you become a journeyman, which means that you know the craft, but you're still under the direction of the master, and a lot of times that you stayed there for the rest of your life, but some people made it to master, and then they could have their own apprentices. Okay, so we start seeing the ability to transfer and to educate future generations on the craft. The reluctance to share how we do things with others, outsiders, or even some insiders. You may not even share it with another silversmith. This restricted technological change. It sort of put a damper on it because remember we talked about how it was important. Knowledge and knowledge sharing leads to innovation, and you didn't have that with guilds. But let's talk about slavery and technological development. Now, slavery was a very important and major source of labor in ancient empires, through the Middle Ages and even through mid-1800s America. When you are in an economic system that requires a lot of labor, man-hours, to do the work, okay, slavery, in a lot of ways, people say, well, this is the most economic way of doing it because you're not continuing to pay people, right? It's like buying a car. Once you've paid for the car keeps working for you. Okay? Same thing with the slave. But there's a problem with the idea of slavery. And the biggest problem is that you need to monitor your slaves and you need to coerce them into doing things. They're not going to volunteer stuff because what's in it for them? So the idea is if you don't do this work, you will be punished. Okay, so that's coercion. So if I'm looking at, well, if I'm going to do this or I'll be punished, the thing is that I'm not going to do any more than I need to do. I'm going to do the bare minimum to get by. So I'm not going to be innovative. I'm not going to come up with better ways of doing a thing because it's not going to benefit me. It's going to benefit my master. I'm also not going to pay attention to detail because paying attention to detail is that extra effort I don't want to give you. Like I said, I'm giving you the least I can do, to get by. Which, when you're talking about farming and things like that, where all you need is labor, yeah, it's doable. It's not great. It's inefficient, but it's doable. Okay? The attitude that manual work was degrading was a major inhibitor because remember we talked about the cumulative and dynamic. So if we have to have a knowledge base from which to work, if we don't know how to do things manually, we don't have that knowledge base. And we can't make it better. Okay? We can't say, well, I really wish we could do this better. Well, if I don't know how to do it better, or I don't know what's wrong, I can't make it better. Let's talk about time and working patterns. Okay? During the Middle Ages, monasteries required precise scheduling of prayers. Okay? They prayed like 9 times a day. And so they would ring the bell at certain times for prayer. As this became an important part because in the Middle Ages, people lived by the church. Okay, it was a huge part of their society. We start seeing clocks. So if you have to keep track of when a certain prayer time is, we start seeing the development of clocks. And once we start seeing the development of clocks, we start seeing people developing routines based around what they have to do. So having lunch at a certain time and completing work at 4 o'clock or getting started at work at a certain time. Now we start seeing people planning their activities around the clock and around time. And what happens is we start producing time as a measurement, as a product. So we're creating a type of commodity. And we see this. We save time, we waste time, we spend time, that kind of stuff. This is the Prague astronomical clock. Okay, it's a medieval clock, and it's the oldest continuously working clock, astronomical clock in existence. It was first installed in 1410. And so even back then, you see how people were, and this is so that everybody in the village could see what time it was. Okay, and I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. So for next class, this is what I want you to do.